My name is Shalhevet Schwartz, and this is Gefet on Daf Yomi, a joint project of Hadra and Yeshivat Drisha. Um, we are nearing the end of Masechet Avodah Zarah. We'll be working today with a sugya on Daf Ayin Bet and end of Daf Ayin Aleph, beginning of Ayin Bet, about the dinim of Gezel Goy, about the laws, not Gezel Goy, from a Goy, about of Gezel Shel Bnei Noach, right, of a Ben Noach Shegazel, a Gentile who steals, right, what are the different ways in which the kind of legal ramifications or punishment or etc. And the legal definition of theft for a Gentile are different from that of a Jew. We know that Gezel is one of the Sheva Mitzvot Bnei Noach, one of the seven Noahide commandments, and that right that for those who learned Sanhedrin, that all of the Mitzvot Bnei Noach are actually considered to be capital crimes. So a Ben Noach who a Ben Noach who steals is going to be chayav mita. Um, but what we're going to see in this sugya are a couple of different ways that the dinim for a Ben Noach shegazal are actually different from the way that the prohibition of gezel applies to Jews. We're going to see on the one hand that there's a different shiur, right? A Jew has to steal at least a sheve pruta in order to be liable. And we're also going to see that that although for a Jew, what happens when a Jew steals, that there's a chiyuv hashava that kicks in, right? An obligation to give back the stolen object. The same does not apply to a Ben Noach, and we're going to see a couple of different explanations for why that is, and a couple of different ultimately kind of repercussions of what that means for this sugya. So we're in the sugya on Daf Ayin Aleph. We're kind of in the course of a discussion about the nature of a kinyan of a Ben Noach, right? How is it that a Ben Noach actually goes about acquiring objects, even through monetary transactions, mekach memkar, and one of the contenders is mishicha, right? We know that movable property for Jews I acquire through mishicha by kind of picking up and moving the object. And the question is whether or not the same is true of a Ben Noach. So Ravina comes into the sugya and brings a memra of Rabbi Yochanan actually about the dinim of Ben Noach shegazal, right, of theft, to perhaps shed light on this machloket about the kinyan, the manner of kinyan of for a Ben Noach. So Amar le Ravina le Rav Ashi Tashma de Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Quotes Rabbi Yochanan as saying, Ben Noach neherag al pachot mishve pruta velo nitan lishavon. So here we see right, two different dinim here. One is that a Ben Noach is neherag even for stealing even less than a shve pruta, despite the fact that the prohibition, right, the same prohibition does not apply for less than a shve pruta for a Jew. That's number one. And number two is lo nitan lishavon. It is not able to be returned. Not totally clear what that means, and the Gemara is even going to try to clarify a little bit what that means, and then the Rishonim we're going to jump in and provide different explanations. So that's the memo of Rabbi Yochanan. What does Ravina bring to prove? If you were to say that mishicha doesn't work, right? That pulling and moving the object is not how a Gentile affects a kinyan, right? What is he being killed for? Which is to say, right? What would it mean for when we say mishicha kona, right? We're saying that there's a halakhic significance to the moment of picking up and moving the object. That's how the object, right, goes from one person's possession to another person's possession. And if that's the case, even for a Gentile, then it would make sense to say that there was halakhic significance to the action that he took, and therefore he would be liable for capital punishment. But if we were to say that the picking up and moving of the object has no halakhic significance, right, that a Ben Noach's kinyan actually happens from the moment of currency exchange and not from the moment of picking up and moving the object, then on some level, right, my act of theft is almost like a halakhically meaningless action, right? Why would I be punished for just moving something around if it remains kind of halachically legally in the possession of the original owner? So the Gemara's answer, so the Ravina's answer to that is going to be Mishum Tzarei Yisrael. The Gemara's answer to that is going to be Mishum Tzarei Yisrael. um, because that the punishment of hariga, right, the capital punishment for the Ben Noach is not because of the halachic significance of the act of Mishicha or the act of Gezela. Rather, he's being punished for because he was mitzarei Israel, right? Because he caused problems, caused trouble, caused hurt, um, caused injury. That's the right word. Caused injury to the Jew. So, right, we actually don't need to prove that there was like halachic acquisition in order for the capital punishment to kick in. And then it goes on to explain, Umay lo nitan lehishavon. What do we mean by lo nitan lehishavon? We mean that eno b'torat hishavon. It's not under the kind of category of or um right. It's not he's not subject to the rule of hishavon. Doesn't have to return the object. So we know that right Jews right there's the isur of lo tigzol is a lav nitak asay, which is to say that right when I violate this lav, so an asay kicks in, which is the mitzvah asay to return the stolen object. Um, and apparently it seems, right, a Novatorah Hishavon, that for a Gentile, that is not the case. That's not true as to why and precisely what that means and why. We're going to take a look at what the Rishonim have to say. So let's look at this Rashi in our sugya on the Dibur Machla Ben Noach. It's a packed Rashi with a lot of different things. So right, Ben Noach Gazalat Israel Pachot Mishveh Pruta, according to Rashi. We're talking about a Ben Noach who steals less than a shveh pruta from a Jew. Afal gav de gabei Yisrael lav mamonahu demachle alei gabei ofei kochavim mamonahu. Right, even though when it comes to a Jew, right, who steals, it is lav mamonahu demachle alei. Right, it is considered less than shveh pruta, considered lav mamona. Right, it's not considered to be mamon. And then what Rashi clarifies about what that means is demachle alei, because he is right the Jew right the people are mochel on it, which is to say if you steal a cent or two from me, it is reasonable to assume that right people in general are mochel, are kind of willing to give up on that kind of small change, right, keep the change. Right, and that's how Rashi is explaining what we mean by lav mamonahu, right? It's not the kind of thing that someone else would be makbid about, right? Even though that's true about Jews, right, or true about Jews with respect to one another, gabeo v'kochavim mamonahu. When it comes to a Gentile, right, it is considered to be mamon. It doesn't really explain beyond that, right? Why would that be? Would that be because the Jew presumably would be mochel to another Jew, or wouldn't be mochel to a Gentile, something like that. Rashi doesn't exactly explain, but essentially the ptor for pachot mishveh pruta, for a gezel and pachot mishveh pruta, right? The reason why in general people are exempt is because of mechila. Mechila applies to a case of a Jew who steals, but does not apply to a case of a Gentile who steals. So that's Rashi's kind of big points, number 1 and 2. Ben Noach nitztava al hagezel b'Sanhedrin, right? We know from the sugya in Sanhedrin about Shav mitzvah Bnei Noach that if Ben Noach is also not allowed to steal the azhara shalahen zohi mitatan. We also know from the sugya there that all of the lavim for Ben Noach are considered to be capitally punishable. In tzrichin hatra, and they also don't write the chidush of the Torah with regard to capital punishment for Jews, that they require hatra, require warning, so that also doesn't apply to a Ben Noach. So that's Rashi, right? What's the difference between right a case of a Jewish thief and a Gentile thief? So for a Jewish thief, the prohibition of theft, or at least the right, why lo nitan lehishavon and no b'torat hishavon, and what's the relationship there between that and the pachot mishveh pruta? So the prohibition of theft, or at least the obligation to return the stolen goods, because here it seems like we're talking about the prohibition, and the torat hishavon kind of it falls under that category as well. The Achronim have a bit of a question about, right, is it true that Jews really are allowed to steal pachot mishveh pruta? Seems like not. Is there a separate isur? Is there an isur, but just not an isur gezel? So it's a Iyun in the Achronim. But either way, either the prohibition or theft, or at least the obligation to the obligation of the Yeshivat Gzela only applies to more than a pruta because Jews are presumably willing to be mochel less than that. And right, the punishment for a Jewish thief is the obligation to return the stolen item. Whereas with the Gentile, right, the prohibition applies to even less than a pruta because mechila is for some reason not applicable when it comes to a Gentile thief, and the punishment is death even without a hatra. So now we're just going to continue on in Rashi to understand, right, a little bit more what we mean about the ina b'torah hishavon. Right? Why is it that the Yeshivat Hagzela does not apply to a Gentile thief? Halo shayach behishavon tekiva de ovid kochavim lo kanye di Yisrael. Klomar. Hachinami kamar ina b'torah shum gzela de ovid kochavim. Right, shum gzela de ovid kochavim tekol heicha de ita de marahi. V'hu hadin l'shaveh pruta. V'hadina ki pachot hashmina din haragala. Okay. So, right, what do we mean when we say eina b'torah hishavon? Why is it that the Gentile does not have to return the stolen, right, the stolen goods? So, right, it goes back to precisely the thing that we just said before, which is right, that ultimately, right, if Mashicha eina kona for a Gentile, then the act of theft itself was halachically meaningless. The punishment of the punishment of the death penalty ultimately comes from Sa'arei Israel, right, from causing injury, but not from the halakhic significance of the acquisition. And because there was no halakhic significance to the acquisition, ultimately, okay, I'm holding on to, let's say, the computer that I stole from you, but if it was still your computer, then it wouldn't be halakhic significance to my returning to the fact that I would return the object either, right? On some level, right, my act of theft isn't really defined as theft; it's defined as injury, and I happen to now have your computer in my house, but I didn't like really steal your computer, right? Because of that. Right, right? It's not really considered to be stolen goods. Right, wherever it is, whether it's in my house or in your house, it still belongs to you. And that is all. And right, the Rashi adds at the end that that's not only right, that explains right the fact right, it's not only applicable to pachot mishaveh pruta, it's also applicable to shaveh pruta, right? Once there was no real kinyan or acquisition of the stolen goods, whether right, and the punishment is because of something else, injury, which explains why that can apply also to less than a shaveh pruta. And a navitorati shavon, I don't have to return it. Right, both the pachot mishaveh pruta and the navitorati shavon are ultimately are emerge from the same fundamental principle, which is that the act of gzela of a Gentile, right, isn't considered to, right, like it doesn't involve any kind of acquisition. Now Tosafot doesn't like this. So, right, why does Tosafot not like this? Right, right, Tosafot quotes Rashi as saying that ultimately the act of theft on the part of the Gentile doesn't generate any kind of halakhic change in the status or ownership of the object. And that is the reason both for pachot mishveh pruta and heraga pachot mishveh pruta, and the reason for a navitorati shavon. Betema, Tosfot doesn't like it. Right? Hare Yisrael nami lo kana hagzela. But right, a Jew also doesn't really acquire the gzela. Right? It's true that mishicha kuna for a Yisrael, right? That if I'm a Jew and I'm buying something, that I acquire it from the moment that I take it. But if you actually look at the sugya about kinyan gzela, that's not true of a gzela, right? There is such a thing as a kinyan gzela. There are certain circumstances under which, if for those who have learned the end of Bava Kama, there are certain circumstances under which I would in fact acquire the stolen object. For example, if I steal logs and I build a bench out of them or something, if I generate some kind of shinui, some kind of physical change in the object, then I'm koneh v'gzela. But under most circumstances, right, the fact that in a case when I'm koneh v'gzela, actually, I don't have to return the object. I get out of my chovat hashava, or at least the chovat hashava changes shape. I just pay back tashlumin money instead of giving back the actual object. right? But so Tosafot saying even for Jews, you're not kona v'gzela, you don't really acquire the object. V'afilu hachi ite b'torah hishavon, dichtive yeshivat gzela. Um, right? There's the requirement to return the actual object as it is applies even in a case when I don't when I wasn't kona. So the fact for Rashi that the a Gentile wasn't kona doesn't really make a difference, right? The chiyuv the both the shiur and the chiyuv hashava seem to have to do with the fact that I can have stolen an object without having acquired it. V'nirad halakhic Perushim. So Tosafot offers a different explanation. Me'achar she'in chiyuv barak mishum tzara d'Yisrael, amahu tzrach lomar v'lo nitan lehishavon. Pshita. So the Tosafot's going back to the Gemara and actually understanding the Shaklavataria a little bit differently. Right. Once I said that I'm right chayav mishum tzara d'Yisrael and therefore can be chayav for pachot mishveh pruta, right? If my chiyuv clearly emerges out of something else, out of injury rather than out of having stolen, then it's obvious that then it becomes clear and obvious that there would be no chiyuv hashava, right? Returning the object is something that I would do to fix the fact that I stole an object. But if in fact my problem wasn't that I stole the object, but was this injury that I caused, right? That I right then maybe chiyuv hashava becomes irrelevant. So pshita v'lekamanda amar shetehei hashava sheicheva. All right, and that's what my inabit why my lo nitan li shavon inabit torah shavon. What does that mean? That lo nitan li shavon, when Rabbi Yochanan says that, he means and right that because the whole chiyuv is mishum tzara d'Yisrael, so it becomes obvious that or it becomes clear or obvious that hashava is just not really a relevant category. So rather than Rashi, who sees the shveh pruta and chovat hashava as emerging from the same broader principle, right, of that there's no kinyan. Tosafot sees the lo nitan lishavon as downstream of the tzara d'Yisrael, right, as something that becomes an obvious consequence of the fact that the chiyuv for Gentile theft is mishum tzara d'Yisrael rather than based about the actual theft. Now, the Meiri offers a totally different explanation of what we mean here, right? Bnei Noach neharagim ashav mitzvot, I'm in the second paragraph. V'zeh amar lo nitan lehishavon, pirusho she'eno b'torah hishavon lahafkia mitato behashavato. Sheharenim chelatim me'eleha. Okay. What does lo nitan, right? What does ena b'torah hishavon mean according to the Meiri? In for Jews, we know that gzela is a lav shenitach say, and the fact that I have a chovat the fact that I have a chovat hashava, if I after I steal something, makes it the case that other punishment, like right in general, as with a lav shenitach say, where we don't give malchut on a lav shenitach say. Why is it? Right, because because I have a different way of amending or making amends for my crime, I don't have to get this other punishment. Right, the fact that the fact that I'm returning the object that's my tikkun for the theft. So I might have thought, according to the Meiri, right, there's this implicit hava mina that the Gemara is working with, that the hashava might get me out of my chiyuv mita if I'm a Gentile. Right, and what do we mean by ena b'torah hishavon? Right, explaining Rabbi Yochanan, lo nitan lishavon means you are liable for capital punishment, and there's no way to get out of it and returning the object doesn't get you out of it. Right, lo nitan lishavon she'eno b'torah hishavon lahafkia mitato behashavato. Right, you can't get out of your chiyuv mita through hishavon, the way that a Jew could get out of their potential kind of like abstract principle chiyuv malchut with hashava. So it's not that the theft is totally or it's not that the chiyuv has nothing to do with actual theft and therefore hashava isn't relevant because we're not talking about actual theft. We are talking about actual theft, but hashava doesn't cut it to get you right. It does the way that, let's say, right, it doesn't work like a lav shenitach say works for Jews. That's the Meiri's answer. And there's going to be a fourth answer, which is a slightly different take that Rashi actually gives in one of the parallel sugyot, right? This memra of Rabbi Yochanan appears in three places, I think, in our sugya in Avodah zarah, also in Eruvin, and also in Yevamot, I believe. But when the sugya appears in Eruvin, and it's interesting because this isn't so clear from Rashi it's himself, but this is at least how Tosafot and several Achronim understand Rashi. Um, so he explains it a little bit differently. Digabe Yisrael, right? Why is it that lo nitan lehishavon? Digabe Yisrael k'tiv v'yeshivat hagzela. Benochri lo k'tiv hashava hilkach kivan she'avar neherag ve'ino mishalem. Um, Right. So Rashi sort of gives two, almost gives two explanations, and Tosfot understand him, and the Achronim understand him more or less according to the second one. Right. The first one seems to be that right the words Yeshivat Drisha they are written in the context of talking about Jews, right? Context of actually the korban that you give after right korban gzela and meila and all those korbanot. So it's specifically talking about Jews. But we just don't see it about non-Jews. So why should there be a chovah hashava? So it seems like the first answer of Rashi, although this is more or less ignored by most of commentators on him or most of later Rishonim, right? It's just that there's a sort of element of Gzerat Katuv here. But then, right, Hilkach, right, how does he, right, Kivan she'avar neherag ve'ino mishalim, right? Once, right, he's violated this prohibition, he is neherag ve'ino mishalim, that he is killed and doesn't have to pay. Kind of later interpreters here will understand Rashi as referring more or less to the principle of kimla bidur abamine, right? That on some level, if there were right, once you're liable for the death penalty, and it's sort of the flip side of the meiri in a way, once you're liable for the death penalty, in general, right, we don't make people who are capitally liable also pay tashlumin for any kind any kinds of crimes. So once he's chayav mita, then he doesn't have to pay more or less from kimle. So here, just kind of to lay it out, four different explanations, more or less, of what's going on here. So Rashi in our sugya, right, that a Gentile who steals never becomes the owner of the stolen object, and therefore there's no significance to or reason for returning the object. We have Tosfot who says that right, the capital punishment is due to the fact that he was mitza'er Yisrael. It has nothing to do with like actual theft, and therefore, so the obligation to return the item, which has to do with actual theft, is irrelevant. Number three, the me'iri, right? Returning the object. What do we mean by lo nitan lishavon? That returning the object wouldn't alleviate his capital liability. But the reverse actually might be right there, and the reverse would be true that it's the execution that atones for the theft, which is sort of similar to what Rashi is saying there at the end. Rashi and Eruvin, right? That he's not obligated to return the stolen items because he's liable for the death penalty, right? Because of kinlay, so you can't be liable for both restitution and for capital punishment. So those really are kind of four totally different ways to understand both kind of the shaklatari of the Gemara and conceptually how the ideas can, right, how these two separate legal oddities of a Bnei Noach shegazal connect to each other, right? What's the neherag al pachot mishvet pruta on the one hand and the lo nitan lehishavon on the other hand? Do they emerge from the same kind of from the same reason? Does one imply the other, etc.? Just kind of one last question that we're going to explore briefly. We're going to look at the end of the Tosafot and Milo Nitan that we saw, right, that we looked at earlier. That's going to actually ask a question about the relationship between this memra of Rabbi Yochanan and the dinim of Gezel Shel Ben Noach with the kind of broader more broadly what's going on in the sugya. So right, Tosafot on my lo nitan ve'im tomar l'mayde parshinan le'el deka amar de meshicha kona bo'oved kochavim l'chule alma hecha deleka zuze kegon b'mitzia u'matana my parich. Right, Tosafot saying, wait a second, I actually kind of think that this isn't a good question, or at least according to some shitot in the Gemara, this isn't a good question. Right, umay ma'ite ra'ya migezel l'mekach u'memka. So right, there are a couple of different kinds of acquisitions that we know about in Shas. Right, there is a bunch of different cases of how people right acquire. So let's say on the one hand we've got lost objects and gifts. On the other hand, monetary transactions. Monetary transactions are kind of most basic kind of acquisition, right? Like, and there's exchange. There's currency on the one hand and meshicha on the other hand. And so there is a way, right? There could be a way to acquire without actually picking up and moving the object, which is to say, it could be that the acquisition takes effect from the moment that I pay for it, right? If I'm buying something. Right? Is it when I pick it up and move it or when I pay for it? Right? Which is the moment when the acquisition comes into effect? And there's a second possibility, which is paying with currency. And according to some opinions in the Gemara, right? This is the conversation that the Gemara is having now, that a Ben Noach would be koneh with ma'ot, right? With paying. That said, when it comes to lost objects and gifts, right? Let's say I find something in the street, or someone is wants to give me their computer with no for no payment. There's no way to acquire it other than Mashiach, right? There's no way to acquire it with currency, and so therefore Mashiach affects the acquisition. So just kind of going back to Tosafot for a second, right? Even if I think that a Ben Noach doesn't acquire in general through monetary transactions with Mashiach, I might still think that Ben Noach would acquire matanot and mitziot through Mashiach. But wait a second. This becomes Tosfot's question on our sugya. Which of those two things is gezel more like, right? But when I steal something and there's no money changing hands, so theoretically it should seem more like lost objects and gifts, right? And if that's the case, right, then why is this a good counterproof about Mashiach Kona or not? Theoretically, the question of gezel, if it seems to be more parallel to lost objects and gifts, it should have no implications for the question of the question that the Gemara is actually dealing with, which is how does a Gentile acquire in a case of a monetary transaction? So what's Tosfot's answer going to be? ויש לומר דספירלה דאינה קונה בעובד כוכבים במקח אף בגזל, דאי אינה קונה בעובד כוכבים במקח אף בגזל נמי לא תקנה, right? The sugya here, or Ravina in our case, is assuming that if a non-Jew can't be kona, that a monetary transaction, right, can't acquire with Mashiach, then it's not, if it doesn't work for monetary transaction, it's not going to work for gezel. Why? Right? It's not actually more similar, right? You think it's more similar to mitzia and matana, but it's not actually similar to mitzia and matana. Why? Right? In the case of mitzia and matana, the person acquires the object in a permitted way. Aval gezel to be surah but with gezel, a case in which I acquire it in a prohibited way, there, if right, because I'm right gezel, I'm acquiring in an impermissible or a prohibited way, right? Then the question of whether Mashiach would work would be dependent on whether Mashiach would work in a case of monetary transaction. It's interesting, right? Like it's right. Tosfot gives us this distinction between, right? Says it's true, gezel is not like mitzia matana, but Tosfot doesn't really explain here why it would be that gezel would actually be more like a monetary transaction. But right, I might want to kind of like offer as a possibility right here, just to show you kind of broadly what Tosfot's saying, and then we'll take a step back, right? Lost objects and gifts, they're acquired in a permissible way, whereas theft, right, is acquired in a forbidden way. They're not comparable, and monetary transactions we know aren't comparable to lost objects and gifts, and so on some level, therefore, we are saying that the theft, we're comparing monetary transactions to theft, and we're saying that they are going to be comparable. So that last step is a little tricky in Tosfot, right? Just because theft isn't like a mitzia matana, just because gezel isn't like a mitzia matana, doesn't really explain why we would see it as kind of more in the bucket of monetary transactions. But I might want to suggest as a possibility that, right, if we think about that on some level there's like more work that has to be done in order to say that an object changes hands in a case when either there's there's a monetary transaction, so someone's actually paying someone, there's a previous owner. It's not just like almost hefker that's sort of sitting out in the street waiting for someone to pick it up and take it. Right? There's kind of like there's more work that has to be done. And I might say that the same is true with gezel, right? The previous owner has no intention of giving it up. So unless, right, what do I do when I steal something? I pick it up and I move it. But if that's not the way that I normally acquire objects, then there's no reason it should work in a case when there are, real owners who aren't willing and eager to let go. Whereas with mitzia matana, it might be that even if Mashiach itself, right, it doesn't actually affect acquisitions in a kind of general sense when it comes to transactions, it might be that when the previous owners are sort of only more loosely holding on to their objects, either because they're willing to give it up as a gift or because they've already lost them, um, then it might be that Mashiach would in fact work. So just to review, we looked at four different explanations for why Gezel Goy would be lo nitan lishavon and what it has to do with the fact that Ben Noach is neherag al pachot mishvet pruta, and then we tried to explore a little bit what it means to think about a kinyan gezela in comparison to the other kinds of kinyanim we know about, monetary transactions, mekach memkar on the one hand, and mitzvah matana, lost objects and gifts on the other. Thank you so much, and see you next week.